Epaminondas was one of the greatest generals of all time. In this video, we are going to find out what tactics he used to destroy the Spartan right flank at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. Hi everyone! This is a World War II historian. And now that Lentulus has taken a well-earned break from making videos, I'm filling in for him with this video on the great Theban general Epaminondas. In our last episode on the Battle of Leuctra, we discussed how Epaminondas executed a brilliant turning movement against the Spartans, decisively defeating them. However, we didn't go into detail about exactly what his plan was. We know from Plutarch that he ordered his left wing to hold their ground, but then ordered the center and right wing to execute a double envelopment around the Spartan positions. But the details are a bit fuzzy. Exactly how did he order his army to maneuver? What were the strengths and weaknesses of the Theban army that allowed him to do this? How did he exploit those? And most importantly, how did he destroy the Spartan right flank? Now, unfortunately, the sources don't give us a lot of details. Xenophon gives us none. While Plutarch is somewhat vague, so we're going to have to make some educated guesses based on what we know about ancient warfare and the armies involved. The main source we'll be drawing on for this is Polybius, who wrote in more detail than the others, although he also wrote 200 years after the fact. So there's a chance details have been lost to time, or his account could be inaccurate. We covered the general setup of the Theban army in our last episode. They had three main: elite infantry, light infantry, and cavalry. Their elite infantry consisted of 4,000 hoplites organized into 16 companies of 250 men each, with each company being commanded by an officer called a chiliarch, which literally means leader of the 100. There were for such companies on the right wing, 5 on the left, and 7 in the center. Each company was made up of heavily armed foot soldiers who fought in the classic Greek hoplite style, shoulder to shoulder in close quarters combat. The hoplites were helmets with horsehair plumes, a red or purple cloak fastened at the shoulder, a shield, and either a long spear and sword or 2 short spears. Their light troops consisted of 1,500 helot and periloco lightly armed with swords, slings and javelins. These troops were not considered citizens, however. Helots were actually slaves who lived on the land owned by the ruling class, and periloco were non-citizen residents in the city. Both groups were allowed to fight alongside the citizens in war. The 700 cavalrymen were divided between the right wing under the command of Epaminondas and the left wing under the command of Pelopidas. The Spartans, on the other hand, had 7,000 men. But only half of these were hoplites, the other half being helots. These hoplites were considered to be among the best fighters in Greece. They were fanatically devoted to war and had extensive experience campaigning around the Peloponnese and even as far away as Thrace. In open country, they would typically deploy their hoplites into deep columns, 8 men wide and 20 to 40 men deep, with their helots holding the flanks. This was standard Spartan practice dating back to the Second Battle of the Delian League in 666 BC. However, at Leuctra, they found themselves hemmed in by forest on one side and a river on another, which limited the amount of maneuvering they could do. Xenophon tells us that the river forced them to deploy their entire force along the narrow front, whereas if they had been in a more open space, they would have stretched their line out to the flanks more thinly. This may have been true, but it seems more likely that Polybius is giving us the real reason why the Spartans deployed the way they did. He says that since the Thebans outnumbered them 2-1, the Spartans tried to compensate for their numerical inferiority by deploying as many of their hoplites as possible along the front, thus presenting a thicker, more imposing shield wall to their opponents. This was a mistake, however. As I mentioned in our last video, the Spartans had placed their elite troops on the right wing under the command of King Cleombrotus, presumably because they expected the bulk of the enemy attack to come through there. This is why the Theban commander Pelopidas decided to send his cavalry to attack the Spartan left, hoping to prevent any reinforcements from coming over to help out their comrades on the right. It appears that the first part of Epaminondas' plan was to pin the Spartans in place with his elite infantry, preventing them from reinforcing their right flank. To accomplish this, he formed his 7 center companies into 2 deep columns, 8 men wide, with his four right-wing companies forming a single deep column on the right. Then he advanced his entire force, unleashing the fury of 8,000 spears aimed at the surprised Spartans. Spartan discipline and training was world-renowned, and they held their ground against the onslaught of the Theban hoplites. However, the Thebans continued their attack, pressing forward and engaging the Spartans in close quarters fighting. It was during this engagement that the Spartans began to falter. According to Plutarch, this happened because the Thebans took advantage of a small opening in the Spartan ranks and shoved two of their spears through the gap. Then when they pulled them back, the whole Spartan line was thrown into confusion. But let's be honest here, guys. Nobody was expecting the Spartans to lose, not even the Thebans. After all, this was the elite military force of Sparta, whose warriors were revered throughout Greece for their martial prowess. So, who were the Thebans to defeat them? Well, several factors contributed to their victory, and all of them had to do with the weaknesses of the Spartans. First, the Spartans were overconfident. Because of their past victories and glorious reputation, they failed to prepare adequately for battle. Xenophon tells us that they made camp carelessly and didn't post any guards. Second, Sparta's military system was outdated. The Spartans had not changed their tactics since the days of their legendary king Leonidas, who died at Thermopylae in 480 BC. And finally, and perhaps most important, was the rigidity of the Spartan social structure. A Spartan citizen could only be a warrior. If he wasn't physically fit to fight or was injured, he was considered a liability and removed from the ranks. Even King Cleombrotus was too injured to fight and had to be carried off the battlefield by his comrades. On the other hand, Thebes employed a much more flexible system. Anyone who couldn't fight, whether because of injury, age, or status, was sent to the rear to assist in any way they could, such as carrying water or acting as extra sets of hands for the wounded. When the Theban hoplites pressed hard against the Spartan shield wall, many Spartans were unable to withstand the pressure. They fell to the ground, dropping their shields, leaving openings in the wall for the Theban hoplites to exploit. Another factor that played into the success of the Theban right wing was their superior numbers. While the Spartans attempted to compensate for their inferiority in numbers by thickening their ranks, this ended up being a fatal mistake. You see, when the Theban hoplites managed to get past the Spartan shields, they would have been met with a wall of spears. But the Spartan wall was only too deep. When the first rank fell, the second rank was too closely packed together to wield their spears effectively, giving the Theban hoplites the advantage in close quarters fighting. At this point, the Spartan right flank was in full retreat, but the battle was still ongoing. The Theban left wing under Pelopidas was having a tough time against the Spartan center, which was holding firm. Meanwhile, on the Theban right, Epaminondas wanted to exploit the success of his troops, but he needed more forces to do it. He ordered the 400 hoplites from his cavalry squadron to come and assist him. Some sources say these were actually mounted infantry, dismounted before the battle and now joining Epaminondas' troops. Others say they were cavalry who fought on foot. Either way, they joined the fray and attacked the retreating Spartans alongside the Theban hoplites. But the Spartans were no longer a cohesive fighting force. Their ranks were broken and they were falling back in disorder toward their camp. Epaminondas ordered his men to pursue them, but they had gone too far and he couldn't get them to turn back. It was at this point that he ordered the whole Theban army to halt. The pursuit would only lead them deeper into the forest, where the thick trees would have made it difficult for the hoplites to fight. Instead, he ordered his troops to regroup and take up their original positions, ready to receive any reinforcements that might come their way. And reinforcements nearly came. Cleombrotus rallied his remaining troops and counterattacked, almost catching the Thebans by surprise. However, the rest of the Spartan hoplites never recovered from the shock of losing their king. Even though Cleombrotus fought like a lion and nearly succeeded in rallying his men, his counterattack ended up being little more than a mob trying to avenge their king rather than a coordinated military action. The entire episode only lasted 1 hour, after which the Spartans were routed and fled to their camp. The Battle of Leuctra was one of the most decisive battles in ancient Greek history. The defeat of Sparta by Thebes marked the end of Spartan dominance in Greece and paved the way for Philip of Macedon to conquer the Peloponnese and push Greek civilization into the classical period. The next time we'll be discussing the Battle of Leuctra is in our episode on how the Theban army compared to the Spartan army. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching. Remember to support the channel, and I'll catch you all next time. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Sacred Band of Thebes. This elite military force has become a bit of a meme in recent years. But how much do you really know about them? Today we're going to be taking a look at this famous band of brothers and answering a question that has been burning my mind for quite some time now. How did the Sacred Band contribute to the outcome at Leuctra? The Sacred Band was a military force raised by the Theban hegemony in the mid-4th century BC under the leadership of the Chian League. It's made up of 150 pairs of male lovers who volunteered for service in the Sacred Band. The Sacred Band is a fascinating subject because these soldiers were not only elite fighters, but they also played an important role during a critical moment in ancient Greek history. And yet the band itself doesn't actually win any battles. And while their actions at Leuctra are often exaggerated, their presence certainly contributed to the outcome of the battle. The story of the Sacred Band begins in 379 BC, when the Athenian Empire was at its height of power. Thebes, however, was no pushover and managed to remain independent from both Athens and Sparta, who were the two major powers vying for control of Greece at this time. This is likely due to the strength of their military, which was spearheaded by two elite hoplite units called the Sacred Band and the Companions. These two forces had an incredible reputation on the battlefield and were key factors in Theban victories at battles like the Battle of the Champions and the First Battle of Leuctra, both of which I covered previously. After the Battle of Leuctra, Thebes went on to conquer much of central Greece and even challenged the Spartans in their own homeland. In 362 BC, the two met again at the Battle of Mantinea, where the Thebans suffered a devastating defeat. The Sacred Band and the Companions took heavy casualties, and the Theban hegemony came to an end shortly after this defeat. The Sacred Band continued to fight alongside the Theban army for a few more decades, but they ceased to exist as an independent unit sometime before 335 BC, marking the end of one of ancient Greece's most elite military forces. But let us rewind a little bit and take a closer look at the Sacred Band and how it came into existence. As I mentioned earlier, the Sacred Band consisted of 150 pairs of male lovers who voluntarily enlisted for service in this elite military force. Despite their small size, the Sacred Band became known throughout Greece for their skill in battle, loyalty to each other, and bravery in the face of danger. The soldiers in the Sacred Band were not allowed to come from the same family, but they could come from the same city. The pairs were also required to be the same age and to have undergone the same military training. Only those who met these strict requirements were eligible to join the Sacred Band. As members of the Sacred Band, soldiers were given special privileges such as access to better equipment and training than other soldiers in the Theban army. They were expected to live together in barracks and were forbidden from marrying, ensuring that their commitment was solely to their partner and to the state. While the Sacred Band wasn't technically part of the Theban constitution, they operated as a kind of military aristocracy within the larger army. Their influence over the other soldiers was so great that the entire Theban army would often be considered as part of the Sacred Band, at least according to Plutarch. In his work, The Life of Pelopidas, he writes, "It was generally agreed that the whole army ought to be regarded as sacred, seeing that every man chose his comrade and shared his danger with him." Despite their reputation, the Sacred Band wasn't invincible. In fact, they were nearly annihilated in battle against the Spartans in 362 BC. Nevertheless, their commitment to each other and their refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds made them legendary. Plutarch writes, "For they fought to the last, all except two who fell into the hands of the Lacedaemonians. One of them, it is said, was carried off by King Agesilaus, who was very desirous to have him in his power, thinking he would prevail upon him to betray the secrets of the Theban army, but could get nothing out of him. For when he asked what the Theban plan of attack was, and what he believed to be the strongest point in their tactics, the captive replied, 'What do you want with that? Then Agesilaus said, "Give me just one piece of information. Is there any way in which I could hurt them?" "Try to destroy their leaders," answered the captive. And so saying, he spat in Agesilaus's face and died. The other escaped while Agesilaus was sacrificing to Apollo at the hour of victory. He fled to the river Alpheus and threw himself into it, and was changed into a frog by an enchantment of the Theban sorceress, or rather by the favor of Apollo. And so ended the glorious band of 150 pairs of lovers, save only the two who escaped destruction. While the account of the Sacred Band being wiped out at Mantinea is exciting, it's probably not true. The fact that the story comes from Plutarch, who was clearly a Theban partisan, should tell you everything you need to know about the accuracy of the story. On top of that, inscriptions from the Theban treasury at Delphi show that the Sacred Band was still intact after 360 to BC and still celebrated as heroes after the battle. So now that we've gotten a basic understanding of the Sacred Band, how exactly did they contribute to the outcome at Leuctra? To answer this question, we have to look to the events leading up to the battle. In 371 BC, the Spartans and their allies confronted the Thebans and their allies at Leuctra. At the time, Thebes was led by two prominent generals, Epaminondas and Pelopidas, who commanded the Sacred Band and the Companion respectively. The Spartans, on the other hand, were led by King Cleombrotus. The Spartan king's younger brother was named Agesilaus, but he wouldn't become king until after Cleombrotus's death at Leuctra. When Cleombrotus realized that he was outnumbered, he tried to make a deal with the Theban commander, Epaminondas. He offered to let the Thebans keep all of the booty if they would allow the Spartans to withdraw without being attacked. Epaminondas refused, though, and told Cleombrotus to either fight or get out. Cleombrotus decided to fight, and the Battle of Leuctra began. As the fighting got underway, the Spartans quickly found themselves in trouble. The Theban left wing, which was protected by a wooded area, held strong against the Spartan attacks, and the center held firm despite being attacked on three sides. It seemed that the Theban right was having trouble holding off the Spartan attack, though, and their allies were already beginning to retreat. Desperate to save the day, Epaminondas took matters into his own hands. He led the Sacred Band and the Companion in a massive counterattack that completely routed the Spartan army. King Cleombrotus was killed in the fighting, and the Spartans suffered a humiliating defeat. Now, if you've watched my video on the Battle of Leuctra, you may be wondering why the Sacred Band was even necessary for the Thebans to win. After all, the Theban army was already winning when Epaminondas decided to lead the Sacred Band into battle. That's a good question, and the answer lies in the composition of the Theban army. And like the Spartan army, which was composed entirely of citizens, the Theban army was made up of citizen soldiers and mercenaries. The mercenaries were useful in that they provided Epaminondas with troops that he could rely on to follow orders without question, but they weren't as effective in battle as the Spartan hoplites. As you can imagine, the mercenaries didn't care about glory or defending their homeland. They were only interested in getting paid. When faced with the Spartan attack on the Theban right, the mercenaries almost immediately broke ranks and fled. If it hadn't been for the Sacred Band and the Companion, who stayed in the fight and rallied the other Theban troops, there's a good chance that the Battle of Leuctra would have turned out very differently. In short, the Sacred Band was crucial to the Theban victory at Leuctra because they prevented the army from falling into complete disarray and losing the battle. They didn't win the battle on their own, but they were vital to the outcome. And that's why the Sacred Band of Thebes will never die. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. Thank you for watching.